All right, in this video, we're going to be talking about Cantos 25 through 28, and really all of them, with the exception of sort of the beginning of Canto 25 that is dealing with the end of the thieves. Um, all of these are focused on the idea of what we call false counselors. In fact, false counselors take up two circles, um, both 8 and 9, and so these are two circles just for fraud that Dante has. So fraud is really one of the worst. Um, Sins for Dante, actually the worst, but then different forms of fraud have different levels of what Dante would consider more evil or worse than others. When we get to the ninth circle, you'll recognize that there's this thing called compound fraud, and that's fraud that's perpetrated against those for whom there's this sort of special bond of trust. But even so, this type of fraud that we're looking at as we go in circle 8 and kind of move towards this process of looking at the different forms of fraud, you can see that Dante really struggles with this mistake and idea of evil that he thinks that it is. So Canto 25 picks up right where we left off with Canto 24. You have Vanni Fucci once again in there. The beginning of 25 still has Vanni Fucci, and he's doing this obscene gesture that signifies the female genitalia, as you can see on your left. This is like basically the medieval version of giving somebody the bird. Um, and so Vanni Fucci is doing this up to the sky and in this place, so it's considered this real extravagant form of holy blasphemy. And so at this point, he's forced to be quiet, and sort of the snakes begin to turn him over and kind of turn him and metamorphosize him into something new. This is all happening in Pistoia. So a lot of the scene takes place here because it's the place where the feud between the white and black guilds originated. And you're seeing and meeting people who sort of create this false council, which causes things to split. Dante, along with several, modern theologians and theologians throughout the time, would be very put off by the idea of how many different sort of denominational differences there are within churches and religions and facets and factions and things like that that there are today. Even in America alone, which is predominantly Christian, there's over 16,000 different denominations. So Dante would have consider this to be explosively horrid. This idea of such splitting, and so he talks about that here, sort of at the beginning of 25, as we see Vanni Fucci change into a completely different animal, becoming less human by the moment. Then you also have Cacus the centaur, who is here because he stole bulls from Hercules' herd, and then he hides them in the future hills of Rome that Romulus and Remus go over, and Hercules had to split open these mountains and then kill Cacus there. In lines 46 through 48, Dante addresses the reader as we begin moving on to a new idea, um, and also explaining the thief's punishment. And so he addresses the reader. This is the sixth time he does it. And every time he does it, it's just a way of Dante wanting to express the importance of the event. So the explanation of the thief's punishments is they're changed into new beings because when you steal something from somebody, you're taking in sort of an extension of that person. So here the thieves are having their personhood stolen from them, being turned into something else. There's this mention of dog days, and there's songs about it. There's movies about it, as you can see. Dog days is a term and an idiom that most people don't know where that comes from, but simply dog days symbolizes this time period of mid-July to mid-September, when the star Sirius in Canis Major, which is one of the hounds of Orion, rises and sets with the sun. Their joining was thought to bring hot weather, which of course would make sense for thieves. And then at the very end, yeah, there is this line in 116 which talks about them being completely changed and more metamorphosized into the member which a man hides. So this, of course, is referring to male genitalia again, which goes back to the idea from the beginning, where you have Vanni Fucci doing the sign, which is called the fig. And so this idea of figs, and then Dante connects that with the idea of figs, that Adam and Eve would both use those leaves to hide from God. Figs leaves are really big, so they could have used it to hide from God. And that's the idea that Dante is wanting to sort of create there. Now, as we move into Canto 26 and kind of get into this idea of the false counselors and their sense of fraud, you need to remember that Dante has been a backslider in a certain way. It reminds us that although Dante in some ways is over a particular intellectual hump, when he has sort of the encounter with Nicholas III, it by no means is automatic. It's not a habit yet. And we're going to see a lot of backsliding on Dante's part. It's sort of the sin of misdirected intellect. In fact, at the beginning of Canto 26, he uses the term wit here, same thing that he used when he called the Muses at the very beginning in Canto 2. So this is really that side that for Dante, that's not something that you learn like by school. It's that innate talent of genius that's given to a person. And so for Dante, there's this sort of um, gloating ability in talking about how intelligent he is. Now, we meet up with Ulysses and Diomedes here. Dante certainly knows about Ulysses, but he only knew about Ulysses from the Latin sources, not from the original Greek. So, for example, the Odysseus, the heroic idea of Odysseus, who is the hero of Homer's great epic, Dante doesn't really know about him firsthand, only in summaries that have been handed down to him from Latin translation. But he knew the role that Odysseus, who now becomes Ulysses, as we move from Greek to Latin, had in Virgil's Aeneid, and basically his role there was to be a resident slimeball among the Greeks. And so there's not a lot of respect here at the beginning for Ulysses, although it does sort of develop off the throughout his time with him. Now, in this canto, there are several motifs. Remember, motifs are just a um, sort of thematic element that happens over and over and over and over throughout. And so in Canto 26, you're going to see fire, whirlwinds, crossing bodies of water, horses, vehicles. These are going to be recurring motifs throughout the canto. So Dante and Virgil go up, and all of these people are sort of inside of flames. It turns out that they have this really interesting punishment, right? They're encased in this tongue of flame. So they're sort of inside the flames. When Virgil and Dante enter this sort of spit flame, we find out that Ulysses and his buddy Diomedes are inside of it. He gets home. We're talking about Ulysses here. When he gets home to Ithaca, he hangs up his hat and says, "You know what? I haven't done everything. I haven't been everywhere." And then he leaves again, and that's sort of the ending of um, the Odyssey. Is that, hey, all of Odysseus' journeys are not over, and he spent so much time trying to get home, and then just to leave it again. So we might want to add that Dante's willingness to do this. Um, and to go with Ulysses and to take this journey with Ulysses throughout this canto is one sign among many that Dante gives his readers, that he sort of wants to play with the big boys. He's dealing with Homer, he's dealing with Virgil, and so this idea of reputation, what they mean to literature and what they mean to intellect, to writing. Dante's ready. He's brought his A game and he's ready to sort of hang out with them. Dante says, "You know what? I'm going to take these stories and I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to add something myself from that story, that Trojan story, that's new and it's original and that sort of takes things in a rather different way." And so that's really what Dante's doing here in this canto. So what we're seeing here is the way to take a look at Ulysses as Dante describes him. And Dante describes him as sort of an anti-Aeneas, whereas Aeneas is all about his arete, his movement towards developing Rome as one of responsibility. On Odysseus, or Ulysses in this case, is one of self-individualism. And basically, Ulysses says, "Hey, what I want to do is I want to go out there. I want to have an experience, and you know, all of man vices, all of human worth. I have to do everything I can. There's nothing that I don't want to experience, right? Very reminiscent of in the Odyssey when he makes sure that his sailors and his men are all plugged their ears and they tie him to the mast so he can hear the siren song. He's a man who needs to hear about himself and to feel that greatness and to experience life. And then there's this sort of kind of knowledge that Dante is trying to warn us here of. And he says, if you look at Ulysses, there's this knowledge that's better for us not to have. And the most important thing that is coming out of this canto is that we have to learn how it is that we're able to make decisions between knowledge that's worth having and worth going after and knowledge that is forbidden. I mean, we all have these huge questions of existential dread or whatever it is that makes us sort of ponder these big ideas that can hurt our brain. And it's totally a great thing for us to think through those ideas or to even sort of encapsulate a sense of doubt or suspicion when it comes to thinking. But there is this sort of discernible idea of, well, what is good knowledge and what's not the best knowledge to have. So uh, Ulysses is like, hey, trust me, let's go. And this is a guy who, of course, doesn't trust anybody, right? He's the man of many twists and turns. He's the man who is very self-deceptive and who is looking out for number one, numero uno. This is the guy who says, I've got to do it all. I've got to see it all. I've got to touch it all. I've got to smell it all myself. This is the guy who won't buy anyone else's version of what he's saying to them. Trust me, he says again and again and again. And so, what a great way of thinking about what fraud is. Here's the guy that says, trust me, I don't trust anything. And ultimately, Dante puts on three, levels of fraud onto Ulysses. One is, of course, the Trojan horse, which is talked about in Virgil's Aeneid, and that's where Odysseus comes up with the idea of bringing in the horse that ultimately leads to the downfall of Troy. And what's really interesting in it is this motif of fire carries over into this because in the Aeneid, when it talks about sort of this snake of little fire spreading out into Troy, and then also second is the tempting of Achilles. This is the tempting of Achilles. Um, really is where Achilles is off on his own before the war, and he is there with his wife or his soon-to-be wife, and he gets her pregnant, and so he has no plans for her to be with his wife at that point. Odysseus basically comes to him and says, "Hey, you need fame, you need honor, you need glory, you need to come with me. We're going to have this war. You're going to fight with us." And so Achilles decides to do that, marries uh, his baby mama the night before, and then leaves her and never comes back. And then, of course, Odysseus, for Sinon's lying at the Palladium, dealing with Athena and sort of the stealing of things out of the temples, and then Sinon lying within to the Trojans. At the end of Canto 26, there's these lines for the deep pass, and Dante sort of brings this up, and he only brings this up one other time, and it's a signifier for death. And it seems that what we're talking about here is Ulysses' death, the death of Ulysses, and the death of, his final journey. His journey has come to an end, and it's weird because isn't he here in hell? But there's this question of, okay, well, is he dead? Is he, now is he just going to go back to that flame? What's going to happen here? Because we're not even sure. Because I mean, if you remember, Odysseus does go, or Ulysses does go to Hades and spend several large amounts of time there exploring and looking at things, but ultimately doesn't find death. So perhaps here this is, especially because we see there's other references sort of to Elijah and to Elisha and sort of people being resurrected and coming back to life. So that's something for critics that are beyond my pay grade. Canto 27, Dante uses a term here at the beginning of this canto, mugiare, which is also used to mean whirlwind from the beginning, from the past Canto 26. And it's sort of this continued motif of sort of a Babel and hell. The people that are full of fraud, they sort of mumble. There's this sort of mumbling, there's this babble to it. Um, and it's here that we meet Guido da Montefeltro, who was a Ghibellini leader for many years. And right at the end of his life, he decided that he would become something else. He would become a member of the Franciscan order. And in fact, he gets involved in some of the political shenanigans of Pope Boniface VIII. Now, for Dante, he has to see that there's this sort of similar temptation in his journey, because, of course, for Dante, he's got to recognize that he has himself a sort of talent and ability, and the question is how should he put this talent and this ability to use? In line 66 of this canto, uh, he doesn't want Guido doesn't want Dante to go back to Earth and tell people about him. He doesn't want to become infamous. He doesn't want people to know that he was in hell. He wants to salvage his reputation as sort of a repentant sinner. So he wants people to think that he's somewhere else. There's also the mention here of a lion and the fox, a lot of focus on the shrewdness of the fox. This, of course, comes from Niccolo Machiavelli in his writing, The Prince, where he's talking about different ideas of kingship. And, and this also just comes into terms of political ideas here. But the lion and the fox, the lion is one that sort of does violence right in your face and says this is the way it is, deal with it, and that sort of sense of courageousness. But sometimes there's also the idea of the king being the fox, the shrewdness, the dealing, the under the table dealings that has to happen, um, for one to become king or president or get a second term in America, who knows? So there are all those sorts of ideas, and and Dante's obviously taking that from Machiavelli there. So Boniface once again is here in this, and it's really this comical scene because Dante and him sort of square off, and there's a lot of just sort of interesting little bits of humor here. But he's so involved in this war, and the Colonna are holed up in the city of Palestrina. If you've ever been there, it's way up on top of a mountain. It'd be a very hard place to take. So Boniface wants to capture the city, and just having enough weapons and soldiers isn't going to do it, largely because of where it's located. He needs a sly old fox to tell him how to take Palestrini. And so he calls Guido de Montefeltro. And that's brother Guido de Montefeltro, right? The Franciscan. The problem with it, of course, is that it's not something that's in Boniface's power to do. It's not in God's power to do as far as that goes because it's a contradiction of terms. And remember, Boniface is, of course, he would consider himself a representative of God. But there was this meaninglessness to wanting to do it. So, and there's this consistent talk throughout this canto where Boniface is talking about holding the keys, and he really doesn't hold anything. He really doesn't, but he keeps on talking as if he's holding the keys to heaven, to forgiveness, to whatever it is. So if you're to be forgiven, it's because you are repentant. If you're repentant, it can't include the knowledge that you're going to do this thing that was wrong. Does that make sense? Boniface is saying, "Hey, go do this wrong thing. I'll take care of it for you. I've got the power to allow it to be repentant." And that, of course, for Dante, he sees that as something completely wrong. So, for Guido, who's a Franciscan, his idea is, "Hey, peace to everybody." He wants everybody to repent from their sins. And so it's just this interesting sort of fraudulentness that we see here, since Guido does help, and as a Franciscan, he's not supposed to be doing such thing, and that's his own sense of fraud. And so, the flaw in Boniface's logic here is really it's just funny as Dante sort of points it out. You have the three of them sort of lined up there talking about this, and it's as if you're having to pick, well, which theology are you going to go with? But Dante recognizes that both Ulysses and Montefeltro are incredibly bright and they have enormous ability. And so it would be stupid for Dante to deny these things. And so, what are the dangers? What are the temptations? What are the things that can happen to people who have great talents but don't have the moral fiber to use these talents well. Those who simply see those talents as a way to advance their own personal agenda. And in that way, this is a very important place for Dante to stop, because certainly he must have been somebody who felt many of those temptations that Ulysses and Guido do as well. Um, Canto 28, 7 through 21, you have this description of blood and of the wounds, and it basically suggests there's more blood and wounds in this pocket than in all the wars fought in the south of Italy from Roman times until a very recent battle before Dante writes. Um, this. So he's talking in sort of a hyperbolic idea of just so much blood, so much. Um, and here in this canto, we're going to meet just a large, many people. I'm only going to talk about a few of them. But these are people that are schismatics. Those are that create splits. God seems to prefer unions, according to Dante. So this is, dealing with politics, religion, families, whatever it is. This idea of the split and the splitting. Um, and it probably comes from the verse, whatever God has brought together, do not let mankind put apart. Um, so we're going to see Muhammad in here. Dante accepted the medieval Christian belief that Muhammad had actually first been a Christian. And so for Dante, Muhammad is first a schismatic. He's also a heretic, but first he's a schismatic. He separates from the faith, he splits the faith. Muhammad's body is actually splitting open, especially on his hands, which parodies the iconography of Christ's wounds. And it was believed that Muhammad was a sort of Nestorian Christian, and Nestorians deny that Christ's humanity and divine natures were united. Once again, they're split as well. And so he was a Nestorian Christian before he founded Islam. And thus he was both a heretic and a schismatic, according to Dante. And so doing that, he also split off and drew away 1/3 of Earth's believers away from the true faith, according to Dante. There's also this mention of Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. His wound suggests that there's this completion of the splitting of the body that began with Muhammad, sort of this vertical slash. And it might and may not refer to the splitting of the Sunnites and the Shiites. We really aren't sure what Dante knew at that point. There's a mention of Dolcino de Tornielli, who became a leader of the Apostolic Brethren after the founder had been burned at the stake, and then he later is, of course, mutilated and burned as well. And the Apostolic Brethren were called heretics by the church, but Dante actually suggests that he's a schismatic, probably because Dante shared some of the similar beliefs of Dolcino de Tornielli. Then you also have Curio here, who helped persuade Caesar to create the split of Rome by crossing the Rubicon. He has one of the most famous sayings from ancient Rome that was used to persuade Caesar, and that's, "Hey, do not delay. Waiting always harms those who are ready." It's a very famous saying. Curio is known as sort of the one that helped push Caesar to that final part of crossing the Rubicon. Also, we meet Bertrand de Born. Now, he was born around 1140, and he was the lord at Hautefort who displaced his brother through treachery, and later he becomes a monk at a Cistercian monastery close to Hautefort. And then you have this connection for a few other people. One is King Henry II of England. Most people would sort of know him as the ancestor, sort of King Arthur, there's also this connection to Richard the Lionheart and Prince John, which would have gone around the Crusades time period. Now, so Henry II was 1155 to 1183. His older brother died at age 2. He was called the young king because he was crowned in 1170 at 15, and then again at 1172 at 17. Young Henry's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the French King Louis the Seventh, I believe, backed his demand that a substantial part of his patrimony be turned over to him. And so there was a resultant conflict among the young king, his father, and his brothers, Richard and John, and it lasted until his death in 1183. His death was much lamented, perhaps less on the account of his virtues than on his prodigal liberality. Um, Many times people confuse him with actually Henry III as well. Then you also have Octipophel, who was David's sort of counselor, and he also counseled Absalom, David's son. So he sort of fostered the son's hatred against his father, and that, of course, resulted in Absalom getting his hair stuck in a tree and dying from that. So he's there as well. And so there's this focus on sort of the contrapasso of false counselors are being split and torn apart. Um, the souls of this Bolja uh, suffer punishments that sort of correspond to the effects of their sins, and how those sins have had an effect on sort of their body politic, the group that they come from. So they're figures of the body politic individually as well as collectively. And this is actually very explicit when Bertrand de Born says that his decapitation is the contrapasso for having sown discord between father and son. He speaks of his trunk as the origin of his head, and sort of this unexpected phrase kind of calls attention to its complexity of both his sin and its punishment. Henry II was both the father, the origin of the young king, and the head of the state, the family. His son was part of the body that should have been subject to Henry II, but also the future head of the state. So Bertrand's encouragements caused sort of this young king to rebel, thus making illegitimate an illegitimate head against the father and ultimately aborting his rightful reign. Um, so Bertrand sort of doubly sins against both the head and the trunk of the body politic, and that's why his contrapasso makes so much sense. So that's what we have to talk about in Cantos. It's a little bit longer video, quite a bit happening in these, but that's what's happened in Cantos 25 through 28. We'll see you next time as we get to the next four, so 29 through 32. And we might just do all of them in the next one. I'm not sure. But until then, we'll see you.